It's wonderful to see everyone here this morning. We're especially glad if you're visiting with us this morning. We're in a study now of the book of Nehemiah that we've titled Rebuilding Your Future. And so we hope if you're visiting with us, you'll come back and continue in that study with us. We're in chapter 2 this morning, and you would think I planned this out really well because we're going to break ground this week on our property here. And our passage this morning, near the end of it, says, "Let us arise and build." So God planned that out, I didn't. But anyway, providentially, we're here in this passage this morning as Nehemiah is there helping rebuild the walls of the city of Jerusalem. Well, let me begin by reading our text for us this morning. Begin in reading in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 11. "So I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. And I arose in the night, I and a few men with me. I did not tell anyone what my God was putting into my mind to do for Jerusalem. And there was no animal with me except the animal on which I was riding. So I went out at night by the valley gate in the direction of the Dragon's Well and onto the refuse gate, inspecting the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and its gates, which were consumed by fire. Then I passed on to the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there was no place for my mount to pass. So I went up at night by the ravine and inspected the wall. Then I entered the valley gate again and returned. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I had done, nor had I as yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or the rest who did the work. Then I said to them, 'You see the bad situation we are in. The Jerusalem is desolate, its gates burned by fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be a reproach.' And I told them how the hand of my God had been favorable to me, and also about the king's words which he had spoken to me. Then they said, 'Let us arise and build.' So they put their hands to the good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official and Geshem the Arab heard it, they mocked us and despised us and said, 'What is this thing you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king?' So I answered them and said to them, 'The God of heaven will give us success. Therefore we, His servants, will arise and build. But you have no portion, right, or memorial in Jerusalem.'" May the Lord bless the reading and the preaching and the hearing of His Word this morning. There's a story I heard years ago about a guy named Bob Zuppler. He was a great football coach at the University of Illinois. And one time at the half, they came in and the team hadn't done very well. And he came in and just gave them this stem winder, this rousing speech at halftime, and had the players all lathered up to go out and win the game. And so at the end, right before they headed out, he said, "I'll tell you what we're going to do." He said, "I'm going to lead you out this door right here. We're going to go out on that field and we're going to win this game in the second half." So he opens the door and runs through there. And the whole team fell into the indoor pool that had recently been constructed there on the campus. The coach, in his enthusiasm, had led his team out the wrong door, and they all just followed him, and so they all ran in to the indoor swimming pool. Now, we see a lot of that in our culture today. Leaders with a lot of enthusiasm, but no clear idea, really, of where they're going. I think we would all agree there's a conspicuous vacuum of leadership today in our country. There's a vacuum of moral leadership in our government. There's a vacuum of male leadership in our families. There's a vacuum all too often of ministerial leadership in our churches. Our nation, our homes, and our churches are suffering from really a tragic lack of leadership today. Someone has said, in fact, it was a university professor years ago, said there's 3 kinds of people. There's those who haven't got a clue what's happening, those who watch what's happening, and those who make things happen. And I like Nehemiah because he's a man who made things happen. He was a man on a mission from God. And he exemplifies for us true, godly, biblical leadership. Now, you might say, well, we're talking about leadership here today, but what do we mean when we define or when we use the term leadership? How do we define it? There's a lot of definitions of leadership out there, but my favorite one is from a very simple one from a guy named Paul Powell. He said, "Leadership is nothing more than seeing what needs to be done, figuring out how to do it, and then getting other people to join you in the effort." That's what leadership is. It's seeing what needs to be done, it's figuring out how you do it, and it's getting people to join you in that effort. Leaders know what to do, they know how to do it, and they know the best time to do it. Now, everything I've read on leadership would say, if you wanted to boil leadership down to one word, leadership is influence. It's influence. And Nehemiah is the consummate leader because he is a consummate influencer of the people there in Jerusalem. Now think about this. The people in Nehemiah's day had been back in the land for 100 years. And he does what they haven't done in 100 years in 52 days. We're going to see that as we go through these later chapters. In 52 days, the walls of the city will be rebuilt. Now, I don't know about you, but that's a guy I'd like to learn a little bit about leadership from. Now, as we trace his actions, we discovered that this book, among other things, is a compelling call to leadership. In Nehemiah, we have patterns of life, but we also have principles of leadership for us to follow. Now, you may say this morning, well, I can kind of check out on this sermon because I'm not a leader, so this is kind of for everybody else. Look, all of us are leaders in some sphere, in some arena. Fathers are leaders in their home. Mothers are leaders with their children. If you're a businessman, you may own your own company and you're a leader in that. Or you may be a woman who owns your own business, or you may be over other people in your company. You may be a teacher and you may have a group of students in a classroom and you're their leader. Here in this church, we have people who lead in a lot of different capacities in our adult Bible fellowships, and on we can go. Look, from Nehemiah, we can discover what it looks like to lead effectively wherever God has placed us. Now, up to this point in the book of Nehemiah, we've seen Nehemiah praying and planning. Remember back in chapter 1 and the first part of chapter 2, he's waiting for God's perfect timing to come to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls. God's laid the burden on his heart, but he's waiting for the perfect time for King Artaxerxes to give him permission. So he's waiting for this perfect time to ask. And he waited for God's providential hand to turn the doorknob of opportunity. And when God turned that doorknob, we saw last time, Nehemiah was ready to go. And we left off last time in chapter 2 and verse 10 as Nehemiah has led the third return of the Jewish people from captivity. Remember, Zerubbabel had led one almost 100 years earlier. Ezra had led one about 14 years earlier. Now it's 444 BC. Nehemiah has led the third return of the Jewish people back to their land. Now, beginning in chapter 2, verse 11, we see Nehemiah getting things going. And this morning what I want to do is look at 4 simple patterns of effective leadership that will instruct us this morning, but also will form our outline for this passage. And I see 4 main thoughts here. We see Nehemiah resting. We see Nehemiah researching. We see Nehemiah rallying or recruiting. And then we see him resisting. Now, getting going here in this passage begins with resting. Nehemiah and his entourage have traveled about 800 miles from Persia to the city of Jerusalem. It's about a 3-month journey. It would have been a long, arduous, exhausting journey. And after this 100-day trip, Nehemiah sees the city of Jerusalem for the very first time. Now, think about that. He's born in Persia in the captivity, never seen the city of Jerusalem. And for the first time, they crest some hill there, and he looks down and sees the city of Jerusalem, and he sees it in ruins. And he must have been overwhelmed. I mean, it's one thing to think about what the city looks like when you're 800 miles away. But I bet seeing it in person, the scope of the task probably in some sense overwhelmed him. I mean, seeing the ruins and the rubble there and the gates burned. The city had been in that condition for 140 years. Grass and weeds probably grown up all over the place. Now, notice in verse 11, it says, when I came to Jerusalem and I was there 3 days. That's all he says. The first thing that happens when Nehemiah and his retinue arrive is nothing. The first thing that happens is nothing. Someone has said it like this: before something happens, nothing happens. Before everything starts, everything stops. You heard the old phrase before, don't just stand there, do something. Well, with Nehemiah, it's don't just do something, stand there. I mean, the action comes to a screeching halt for 3 days when he arrives there in the city of Jerusalem. Now, I like what Stephen Davey, one commentator, says. He says, this is not exactly what you would expect to read. Nehemiah has the permission of the king. He has the financing he needs for the work. But for 3 days, he's not told anyone in Jerusalem why he's even come. I would have expected Nehemiah to set up a trailer on the side, unload his gear, unpack his tools, hire the bricklayers, roll in the heavy equipment, interview subcontractors, and have a backhoe start digging the footings. Let's build some walls around here. But he says, maybe you're tempted to ask, what's the holdup, Nehemiah? You're losing time, man. Get going. And for all of us here that are leaders, that's the natural instinct and inclination, right? Is to get going and get working. In fact, one of the guys talked to me after the last service, and he said, I appreciate this message today because whenever I'm not doing something, I feel like I'm lazy. You know, a lot of people have that idea. You just got to constantly be charging and constantly going forward. But look, this 3-month journey had taken its toll. And Nehemiah knew that he needed rest and to be re-energized in order to really survey the situation and get everything going and to have the energy to rally the people. So he pauses to rest and to recuperate and to get re-energized. Look, you cannot be a good leader and be exhausted. You lose perspective. Burned out leaders don't help anybody. I read a quote that's been around a long time. I've read that George Patton said it. I've read that Vince Lombardi said it. I don't know who said it, but it's good. And that is that fatigue makes cowards of us all. And when you're tired and you're exhausted, you lose your courage, you lose perspective, you lose your motivation. And the truth is, if you really think about it in your own life, we can often do more by doing less. When you're energized and you're rested and you're ready, often you can do more than you could do if you just keep plowing forward and just run yourself into the ground. I read the story about an angry church member that saw her pastor on Sunday, and she said, I phoned you last Monday and tried to call and get a hold of you all day, and I was unable to get a hold of you. And the pastor said, well, Monday's my day off. The woman said, what? She said, a day off? She said, well, the devil never takes a day off. And the pastor said, that's right, but I didn't know the devil is my example. Jesus is our example, right? Not the devil. And Jesus often took time off to rest and to pray. And we need to follow His example. In fact, in Mark 6:30, Jesus told His disciples, come apart by yourselves to a lonely place and rest a while. They'd been busy and hurried and harried, and Jesus calls His disciples away to rest. Vance Havner, the old Baptist preacher, that verse Jesus said, come apart by yourselves. Vance Havner used to say, if you don't come apart and rest, you will come apart. And that's true. Eventually you'll just come apart and you won't be any good to anybody. So the first thing Nehemiah does is get rested up and get prayed up and spend time alone with God. I remember when I was at Dallas Seminary, I heard a quote down there from that floated around from Dr. Lewis Sperry Chafer, who founded Dallas Seminary. And when he was the president there for many years, he used to tell the students in chapel, men, sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is to get a good night's sleep. And I think people don't think about that. You know, they think, well, gosh, if I'm sleeping or resting, I'm just being lazy. But sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is to get rested and rejuvenated. And you say, well, what was Nehemiah doing those 3 days? Well, we don't know. He was resting. I'm sure he was praying, probably making some relationships, meeting some people there. But I love verse 12. He said, I arose in the night, I and the few men with me. I did not tell anyone what God was putting into my mind or my heart. During those 3 days of rest and recuperation and prayer, God was pouring things into the heart and the mind of Nehemiah. Things that He wouldn't have been able to pour into him if he was busy running and hurrying and scurrying about. So God, getting going here begins with a rested leadership. Effective leaders must be rested and in tune with God to be effective. We have to have a balanced rhythm of work and rest. Now, I'm sure there's some of you here this morning that are saying, well, man, in my business, you don't know what's going on with my job. I'd love to have some rest, believe me. Or maybe you've got children at home, you're caring for a father, you work every day during the day and you come home in the evening and small children there. You say, man, I'd love to rest. Look, we have to find a balance of that, and it may take time to get that rhythm, and you may just have to find it in small portions here and there and with small respites. But if you just keep going and burning the candle at both ends and charging forward, and you never find a balance and a rhythm of rest and work in your life, you'll be burned out and you'll lose perspective, and you're not going to be a good leader. Now, after his resting, we find Nehemiah researching. After relaxation comes investigation. The man of tears and prayer in chapter 1 is the practical strategist now here in chapter 2. And I don't want to look all through verses 12 to 16 because it mentions a lot of gates and wells and things like that we're not familiar with. But Nehemiah takes a midnight journey through the city of Jerusalem. He starts on the western part of the city along the southern wall, goes over to the eastern side of the city because he wants to see the devastation firsthand. There's something about seeing things with your own eyes. And so he's going to size up what needs to be done. He's going to conduct a feasibility study, if you will. I like to call it getting the lay of the land. He wants to see what's going on. So he needs to define the size and the scope of his task. Now look, it's important for all of us here to work hard, but it's even more important to work smart. And Nehemiah is a smart leader. He goes out at night under darkness, and he goes out and does his homework. And you say, why did he go out at night? I mean, you couldn't see as well. Well, he wants to fly under the radar and stay low-key in this. He wants to kind of keep his cards close to his chest, if you will. So he only, it says in here, takes one animal with him, the one on which he's riding. So he wants the utmost secrecy in this. So it's kind of a clandestine journey in the evening that he makes. So he wants to survey all of this without drawing a lot of attention to himself. Because remember, we're going to see at the end of this passage, we've already seen at the beginning, he's got enemies. And he doesn't want the enemies to get a head start in knowing his intentions. So he slips out secretly under the cover of darkness at night to make his investigation. Now, he must have been devastated seeing all of this devastation, all of this destruction up close. And think about at night how things even look kind of even maybe more haunting, if you will, kind of walking among these ruins. It was probably worse than he even imagined it was. But what we see here is effective godly leadership requires preparation. He's developing a God-directed plan. And trusting God is not synonymous with thoughtlessness and sloppiness and disorganization. Some people think, well, I'm just trusting God, and they don't understand that they have to plan and organize and be thoughtful in what they do. I like the way puts it. He says faith and planning must go together. When zealous Christians with strong faith allow themselves to go goofy when it comes to orchestrating a cherished enterprise, failure regularly results. Not because God is not responsive to faith, but because it is not His way to applaud and bless goofiness. Now, I like that. God doesn't applaud and bless goofiness. He applauds and He blesses people who pray and who wait and who rest and who trust in Him and who also strategize and who plan. So Nehemiah's practical preparation here is a model for us. He carefully develops a plan. Nehemiah is not like how I heard Christopher Columbus described one time. They said when he left, he didn't know where he was going. When he got there, he didn't know where he was. And when he got back home, he didn't know where he'd been. And that's the way a lot of leaders are. But not Nehemiah. He knows where he's going. He knows where he is. He knows what's happening. He has a clear plan. All of us here that are parents or grandparents will tell our kids or grandkids sometimes things that we think will help them in life. Now, sometimes it's solicited, sometimes it's not, but we usually tell them anyway, right? But one of the things I've told my boys all through the years is that in life there is no substitute for preparation. There are a lot of people that are extremely intelligent, they have great charisma, they rely on that, and if they do, they'll be a failure. No matter how smart you are, no matter how much charisma you have, no matter how shrewd you are, nothing substitutes for preparation. You have to be prepared in what you do, whatever it is in life. Preparation is key. I ran across this little alliterated statement. It's called the 7 P's of planning. You all know that I like alliteration, starting words with the same letter. Listen to these 7 P's of planning. Proper prior planning prevents pitifully poor performance. That's pretty good, isn't it? Proper prior planning prevents pitifully poor performance. And that's what Nehemiah does here. Now, after surveying the situation and getting his head straight, Nehemiah now is ready to recruit other people to help him. Nehemiah is ready to unveil his plan for the people, if you will. So he's ready now to pull the trigger. So Nehemiah has planned his work, and now he's going to work his plan. And I call this the rallying here of Nehemiah, or the recruiting. So Nehemiah motivates the people to follow him now in rebuilding the walls. He can't do it himself. He's got the plan. He's rested. He's done his research. But he has to have the cooperation of the people. So it's the job now to rally them to follow this call. I like what Harry Truman said. He said, leadership is the ability to get men to do what they don't want to do and like it. That's a good definition. It's the ability to get people to do what they don't want to do and like it. And that's exactly what we're going to see in the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah is going to get these people to do something they haven't done now for 100 years. But we're going to find out when they get into these later chapters, the people are going to like it. They're going to thrive in doing what God's called them to do. Now, one of the important things for leaders is to motivate people. Leaders motivate. Now, good leaders, effective leaders, godly leaders don't manipulate people, but they motivate people. Now, a lot of people do use manipulation, but that's not an effective or a godly tool ultimately. Now, in verse 17, we see how he motivates the people here, and we see that Nehemiah sees things that other people don't see. And that's one of the traits of a leader. Leaders see things other people don't see. Look at verse 17. Then I said to them, you see the bad situation we're in. Now, they obviously saw that. They'd been living there for decades in the midst of the ruins and the rubble. They saw it. But Nehemiah saw more out there in the dark at midnight than they had seen in the light. He saw what God was calling them to do. Leaders see what other people don't see, and they help them see it. I like the story of Walt Disney. On October the 1st, 1971, 5 years after Walt Disney died, Disney World had its grand opening. And during the dedication ceremony, someone said to Mrs. Walt Disney, isn't it a shame that Walt didn't live to see this? And her response was, he did see it, that's why it's here. That's good, isn't it? He'd already seen it. He saw something that other people didn't see, and he helped them see it. And he rallied them, of course, to bring it to fruition. And Nehemiah is like that, and we need to be like that as well. Look, the people who were there, they saw the walls torn down and the gates burned. Everybody could see that. They saw the devastation, but Nehemiah sees something they don't see. He sees the disgrace of it. They saw the rubble and the ruin, but he sees the reproach. Notice the end of verse 17, that we may no longer be a reproach. The glory and the reputation of God was being mocked and maligned by the surrounding pagan nations. They're saying, look, Yahweh, this God they claim to worship, He's not even powerful enough to rebuild the walls of their city. If you go back to chapter 1 and verse 3, you'll notice that Nehemiah says that the city's in great distress and it's a reproach. Nehemiah moves the people by what moves him, and what moves Nehemiah is a passion for the glory of God and for the name of God. That's what motivates him. He doesn't want to see this city a disgrace or a reproach upon the name of God. That's what Nehemiah cares about. You know, there are a lot of ways to motivate people. You can motivate people extrinsically, externally, promising them things or that'll be good for them or whatever. You can also motivate people intrinsically, internally. And that's the more powerful motivation. Nehemiah moves the people intrinsically here. Notice he doesn't come and say, if you all would build the walls, it would give you a lot more security. You'd be safe. Now that's true, right? But that's not the main motivation. He also doesn't say, look, if you guys would get these walls built and you have safety and security here, businesses are going to come here and you guys are going to make a lot more money. Now that would motivate them. But notice he doesn't use those things. He uses intrinsic motivation of the glory of God. Look, you and I can motivate people. You can motivate your kids or grandkids by guilt. You can motivate people by good. You can tell them it's going to be good for you. But the highest motivation is the glory of God. God's name is bound up in what we do, and we want to glorify God into things that we do. Cheryl and I went and saw the movie Darkest Hour a couple months ago about Winston Churchill, kind of at the beginning of the war and things happening. And they had in the movie, there are several of his speeches. And I was reminded of the one when the Nazis had just occupied Belgium, France, and Holland. Just 3 days after that, Churchill gives one of his great speeches. Now, how about this for motivating people? I have nothing to offer you but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. That's it. That's the beginning of his speech, to motivate them, to rally these people. But he's using intrinsic motivation. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and suffering. You ask, what is our policy? I can say it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all of our might and all of our strength that God can give us. To wage war against a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalog of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word. It is victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory however long and hard the road may be. For without victory, there is no survival. So what happened when he gave this speech? What was the result? The nation rallied behind him. Men signed up by the tens of thousands to defend their homeland. Because Churchill appealed to love of country. He appealed to what was right. And he appealed to values worth dying for. And that was cause enough. Later, when the bombs fell and it appeared Great Britain would have to stand all alone, he said this, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches, fight on the landing grounds, fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. Now again, not exactly a lot of extrinsic motivation of all the good it's going to do for you in your life, but he's appealing to something within them. And that's what Nehemiah does here. He says, look, the motivation for you to do this is the glory of God. So it's not a disgrace and a reproach any longer. And that is cause enough for us, or at least it should be. The cause itself should be enough. And if you have to get something from God before you'll give something, then you're not where you need to be spiritually. Because the glory of God should be reason enough for us to be motivated to serve Him. That's something that I think is important for all of us to, again, share with our children and our grandchildren. It's good to tell your kids, don't do this, it's going to be bad for you. Don't do this, it's going to be harmful. Don't do that, it's going to get you arrested, whatever else. But I think the highest and the greatest motivation is to tell them, you need to do these things because God is worthy of glory and honor. You need to do it to glorify His name. That's why you need to do what you do. And they need to see that in us. That's the highest goal and aim in our lives. It's tragic here that the people had been back in the land for 100 years and the wall is still broken down. And it's almost like when you read this passage, the people had gotten used to it. They'd kind of gotten used to living among the ruins and the rubble. And I wonder today how many people maybe in their homes or their families have gotten used to living among ruins. It's kind of gotten used to it. And they don't have a deep sense inside of them that this is a reproach to God. It's a disgrace to His name. And this needs to be fixed. It needs to be corrected. Look, there's people here this morning, I'm sure, that your marriage is in ruins and maybe it's been that way a long time and you've just gotten used to it. Marriages can be mediocre or can be terrible and people can just kind of go along and function. They've gotten used to the disgrace and the reproach. But look, again, in our families, in our homes, in our marriages, in this church, in your business, wherever it is, the glory of God is what's ultimately at stake. And what leaders do is they come in and they say, this needs to change. We've got to change this. So I would encourage you this morning, if you've just been getting used to things in your marriage or in your home or your family or wherever it may be, that you'll step up as a husband or a father or an employer or whatever it is and say, this needs to change. My life, my business, my home, my family, it's about the glory of God. God's name is in disgrace and in reproach. We've got to change that. That's the ultimate motivation that Nehemiah uses. One other thing here in verse 17, and then we'll move on. He said to them, you see the bad situation we're in, destruction and desolate, it's burnt, gates are burned by fire. Let us rebuild the walls that we may no longer be a reproach. Notice he says we, and then us, and then we. It's not you. You guys have been a reproach, and you guys need to rebuild this. Nehemiah identifies with the people. And there's a lesson here that you can't inspire people at a distance. Nehemiah leads by example. I mean, he's in this thing with them. And ultimately, people don't follow projects and programs. They follow leaders. And they follow their enthusiasm and their example. And they call them to join the enterprise. And Nehemiah, we see here in his life, he's not passive. I mean, this man is engaged. He's prayerful. He's intense. He's come 100 miles to be with them. And he's bursting with the glory of God. And that's the kind of fathers and that's the kind of mothers and the kind of employers and the kind of elders we need in this church. That's the kind of leader that all of us want to follow. Because you can't motivate people from the box seats. And he's down there with them. He says, we, us, we. This is what God has called us to do. And in verse 18 he says, I told them how the hand of my God had been favorable to me and about the king's words which he'd spoken to me. And they said, let us arise and build and put their hands to the good work. Nehemiah gives testimony of God's faithfulness to him. He tells them what God has done in his own life. He says, look, God's hand is on me. And when I was there before King Artaxerxes, God turned his heart to allow me to come and to be with you here. In other words, it's evident that God is using Nehemiah. And he wants them to know that God is doing all of this. Notice what he says, the hand of God has been favorable to me. I told him about the king's words which he'd spoken. He's saying, look, it wasn't my personal charisma and charm and my powers of persuasion that got King Artaxerxes to let me come here. It was God himself. God's hand is upon this. So Nehemiah is a man who's persuaded that what he's doing is the will of God and that God's hand is upon it. And if we want to persuade and motivate other people, they better see it in us. It's hard to persuade other people if you're not persuaded, right? If you want to motivate your children and your grandchildren to follow the Lord, do they see it in you? Do they see that you're persuaded? Look, a real, true, living testimony for God is a powerful motivation for other people to follow you as you follow Christ. But again, to persuade others, you've got to be persuaded yourself. Leaders are persuaded people. And the result we see of all this, the people are fired up. Let us arise and build. So they put their hands to the good work. Now immediately when that happens, what do we find? Resistance. Remember the guys we met up in verse 10, Sanballat and Tobiah? Here they are again. Right when the work starts, they're ready to meet it with opposition. Satan always resists the work of God, and he always tries to derail it right out of the chute. So these men show up right as the building starts. And Sanballat the Horonite, we're going to meet these guys later, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on these verses this morning, but he's the governor of Samaria, which is north of Judah. Tobiah the Ammonite, he's the governor of Ammon, which is to the east of Jerusalem and of Judah. And Geshem the Arab, he's an Arab chieftain. He's head of a lot of Arab states down to the south of Judah and of Jerusalem. So kind of the nations that surround Israel, this troublesome trio I like to call them, they're opposed to what God is doing and they're energized by Satan. And as I said a few minutes ago, these guys aren't going to give up. We're going to see him in chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6. We're going to see Tobiah again all the way at the end of the book. I mean, these guys are relentless in their opposition to the work of God. And they come in and they begin to ridicule and mock the thing. And then they also accuse the Jews of rebellion. You know, you're rebelling against the king in doing all of this. Now, I love what Nehemiah says. I answered them and said to them, the God of heaven will give us success. He doesn't say, I'm the cupbearer of Artaxerxes. I've come in his authority. You know, we've got Artaxerxes and his power behind us. He appeals to God himself. The God of heaven will give us success. And by the way, that's a good thing to say at the beginning of any project or anything we do in life. The God of heaven is going to give us success. If there's any success, it's going to be because God has done it. We, his servants, will arise and build. But you have no portion, right, or memorial in Jerusalem. He basically says, you guys get out of here. You got no right to be here. Now, they're going to show up later, and we'll talk about how Nehemiah deals with them at that point in time. But he focuses on what God will do. I love that. Look, whatever sphere God has given you to be a leader, leaders are people who are rested and who are in tune with God. They practice a rhythm of rest and work that allows them to be at full force and to have a proper perspective of what's going on. Leaders see what other people don't see, and they help them see it. Leaders appeal to the highest cause, and that is the glory of God. Look, there are other things we can use to motivate people as well, but the ultimate motivation underneath everything is to glorify God and to glorify His name. Leaders identify with the people they lead. It's not you, you, you. It's we, us, we. He identifies with the people. Leaders have a testimony and evidence of God's work in their lives, and they're persuaded that God's hand is upon them and that God is leading and guiding what they're doing. And finally, leaders wisely, courageously resist opposition when they know that what they're doing is the will of God. We'll develop a lot of these things later as we go along. We'll see these throughout the book. But I want to just close this morning with this. We've been talking a lot this morning about planning and strategizing. But do you know God is the ultimate planner in the universe? God has a plan for creation. But God also has a plan for mankind, and part of God's plan for mankind is to save us from our sins. And God's plan of salvation is a wonderful plan. It's a beautiful plan. In fact, it's the greatest thing you'll ever hear in your life. That God sent His Son in the fullness of time, the perfect time, to come and die on the cross for our sins and rise from the dead. God's plan was for Jesus to come and to die in your place and to die in my place as our substitute. And let me just say this morning. This is a blunt statement, but it's true. There's no other plan. That's the only plan. The only plan that exists in this universe for getting you and me to heaven and saving us from our sins is God's plan through Jesus Christ. And God's planned it all. He's performed it all. God has done it all. And all you and I have to do is to come and to receive it. Won't you do that this morning if you've never done that? Look, a lot of you here, most of you here are successful in a lot of things you do in life. You're big planners, you're strategizers. Don't leave your salvation to chance. Why would you plan everything in this life and leave your eternal destiny to chance? It's an old saying that says, a fool is someone whose plans end at the grave. You don't want your plans to end at the grave. In fact, the most important plans you'll make is what happens to you after you leave this life, where you'll spend eternity, your eternal destiny. So if you've never received the Lord Jesus, I hope you can see this wonderful, beautiful plan of salvation that God has. And you can rest in that this morning. Take the Lord Jesus to be your Savior. Let's pray together.